the British royal family, tea, corgis, and endless news scandals. But did you know that King Charles III got his surname because of German bombers that terrorized London? And that today's high-tech air defense systems protecting countries around the world have their roots in a desperate attempt to stop these bombers that probably had more fabric than your grandma's curtains? Well, our story begins on June 13th, 1917. The war had been grinding on for 3 years. Millions were dead in France and Belgium, but London had been quiet for almost a year. No zeppelins, no bombs, just the usual rhythm of city life. People went to work, rode the bus, and complained about the weather. The war was something you read about in the papers, not something that happened close to home. But around 10:30, a low droning sound rolled across the sky. Faces turned upward, as 14 aircraft flying in tight formation moved steadily toward the city, high above the rooftops as crowds gathered in the streets, squinting against the sun at the dark shapes overhead. To most, they looked like just another flight of British patrol planes. Nothing to worry about, really, but that optimism lasted about 3 seconds when 72 bombs turned human curiosity into the world's fastest game of hide-and-seek. Explosions ripped through the East End, windows shattered, buildings caught fire, rooftops blew apart. By the time the German Gotha G4 bombers disappeared back toward the horizon, 162 civilians were dead, and over 400 were wounded. It was the deadliest air raid Britain would experience in the entire war. As for the German planes, not a single one was shot down. The Gotha G4 was considered cutting edge in 1917. It also looked like someone tried to build an aircraft out of a shed. In a way, both things were kind of true. Wooden frame, fabric skin, two massive Mercedes engines with 260 horsepower mounted backward, pushing instead of pulling, making this low droning hum you could hear from miles away. The thing had a wingspan of almost 24 meters, which is even wider than a lot of modern jets we have today, and weighed about as much as a delivery truck. It wasn't fast, it wasn't agile, and it definitely wasn't comfortable. Imagine flying for 6 hours at an altitude of 3,000 to 5,000 meters in sub-zero winds, sucking oxygen through a rubber tube like a deranged bagpipe player. No heating, no pressurization, or an in-flight magazine. And don't get me started on the toilet situation. Not exactly built for small talk and comfort on a long-haul flight. However, the Gotha's impact started even before the major London raids. On May 25, 1917, a squadron of 23 Gothas set out for London, but were forced to turn back due to heavy cloud cover. And instead, they diverted their attack to the coastal town of Folkestone and the nearby Shorncliffe military camp, dropping bombs that killed 95 people and wounded 192. One bomb in a busy shopping street alone killed over 40 people. The raid delivered a significant Gotha shock and immediately exposed the vulnerability of Britain's home defenses, even before the famous London attacks. But here's what made the Gotha dangerous. It could go places other aircraft couldn't. It flew high enough that most British fighters couldn't reach it. It had the range to cross the Channel, bomb London, and make it back to Belgium. And it carried 500 kilograms of bombs, which was enough to throw chaos, cause some serious damage as it rained fire from the sky. But what made it really nasty was the defense. Most bombers had guns in obvious spots. The Gotha had the Gotha Tunnel, a literal trench cut in the belly of the fuselage. One gunner crawled in there with a machine gun, firing down through the floor and up through the roof. Fighters sneaking underneath, wooden confetti. That single guy covered blind spots that would have needed 2 gunners on other planes, offering a 360-degree kill zone. Germany had tried this before with Zeppelins, those giant hydrogen-filled airships that floated over and dropped bombs in the dark. Terrifying and elegant, until a single incendiary bullet turned them into the world's most expensive fireworks display as their crews bailed out, secretly praying their parachutes would work better than the ship's fire insurance. So by 1916, Zeppelins were getting shot down left, right, and center. So that's when the Germans decided to shift gears. Their answer was the Gotha bombers. Smaller, faster, harder to hit. And unlike a giant bag of gas, it didn't explode quite so easily. Now you might be asking, what's the point? Why fly all the way to London just to drop bombs on random streets? See, World War I was stuck. The Western Front was a nightmare of trenches and barbed wire, millions of soldiers hiding in ditches, shooting at each other, gaining and losing the same 100 meters of mud for years. Nobody could break through, so military planners started thinking differently. If you can't beat the enemy army, maybe you can break the country behind it, destroy their factories, wreck their railways, and if a few bombs happen to land on civilian neighborhood, well, maybe that'll convince the population to demand peace. It's ugly logic, but it's logic. The Germans weren't the only ones doing it. Everyone was bombing everyone by the end of the war. But they were the first to really commit to it. And the Gotha raids on London were the most dramatic example. Here's what the German generals understood that nobody wanted to say out loud. You don't have to destroy a city to break it. You just have to make normal people too scared to live their lives and go to work. That would eventually make them pressure their government to negotiate and break their will. Well, did it work? We'll get to that. So, Back to our story. Now imagine you're a Londoner. You've been told the war is being won. You've been told the Navy controls the seas. You've been told you're safe. And then a fleet of German bombers just strolled over your city in broad daylight, dropped bombs, and left. Fear soon had a body count. The public reaction was intense. 500,000 Londoners started hiding in tube stations during alerts. 1917, not the Blitz. This invented that iconic image. The funerals drew thousands. 15 East London school kids buried in one mass grave, covered with a mountain of flower arrangements. And the newspapers that day? The headlines were about baby killers and the Gotha massacre. But the anger wasn't just aimed at Germany. People wanted to know how this happened. How did 14 bombers fly into the heart of the British Empire without anyone stopping them? And that anger started flowing uphill, toward the military, toward the government, toward the king. But here's where it gets awkward. King George V was already in a tricky spot. There was a war on, people were suffering, and the monarchy was starting to look a bit out of touch. Revolutionary sentiment was in the air, and the Russian Tsar had just been overthrown a few months earlier. The British public wasn't in a forgiving mood. And then someone at the palace had a horrible realization. The king's family name, the official on the books "This is who we are" name, was Saxe-Coburg Gotha. Gotha, same as the bomber. What was coming at the British royal family made the latest scandals with Prince Andrew look like parking tickets. I like to imagine the PR advisor who figured this out back then, staring at a newspaper headline that says Gotha massacre right next to a story about the royal family, and then quietly banging his head against the wall. You see, back then as a royal, you couldn't just marry anyone you liked. You had to marry other royals, even if they didn't speak your language. And as you expected, the British royal family had German roots. Queen Victoria married a German prince and the name stuck. Before the war, nobody cared. European royalty was basically one big posh version of a small town in West Virginia. Basically, half the monarchs in Europe were cousins. So when the newspapers made the connection, their cartoonists had their moment. Suddenly, the palace's PR team needed a lot more gin. You see, the public, already furious about the raid, started asking uncomfortable questions about whose side the royals were really on. But July 7th sealed it, over 200 dead in one afternoon. 2 raids, 5 weeks apart, turned the name Gotha radioactive. All of a sudden, the palace panic cranked to 11. So, faster than a pint of beer gets emptied at a football match, King George V made a special announcement. The royal house of Saxe-Coburg Gotha was no more. From now on, the royal family would be known as the House of Windsor. Windsor after the castle, as English as rain, British manners, or fish and chips. And that, my friends, is how a German World War I plane accidentally gave the British royal family a new name. The House of Windsor, King Charles III's last name today, exists because of a PR disaster caused by these ancient German bombers. But that's not even the biggest consequence of the Gotha raids, not by a long shot. While the palace was dealing with its branding crisis, the military was having its own mess to deal with. A formal investigation revealed what everyone already suspected. The defense had been a disaster. The army and navy each had their own air service, and they shared information the way a divorced couple shares custody. Technically possible, but nobody was happy about it, and things kept falling through the cracks. Unfortunately, the things falling through the cracks were German bombs. The government turned to General Jan Smuts to compile an investigation, and his findings reflected the harsh reality. Britain needed a single unified air force, one service, one command, focused on both defense and attack. So on April 1st, 1918, the Royal Air Force was born, the world's first independent air force. Think about that. The Royal Air Force, RAF, which would go on to win the Battle of Britain, fly Spitfires and Lancasters, and become one of the most famous air forces in history, exists because German bombers embarrassed Britain into structuring it this way. But there was more. General Edward Ashmore was given the job of fixing London's defenses. What he built was something completely new. Before the Gotha raids, air defense was basically hear something, shoot at it, hope for the best. Ashmore created a system. Anti-aircraft guns were arranged in defensive rings around the city, searchlights to spot night raiders, barrage balloons to force bombers higher, an observer corps with telephones and wireless reporting aircraft movements in real time, fighter squadrons positioned at specific points, scrambling to specific coordinates. For the first time, guns, lights, balloons, observers, and aircraft worked together as one integrated network. This was the foundation of air defense. 20 years later, when Hitler's Luftwaffe tried to bomb Britain into submission, they ran into the Dowding system, a radar-augmented network that coordinated fighters with ground control in ways the Germans couldn't match. It won the Battle of Britain. But back to our story. The Gothas kept coming, of course. More raids through 1917 and into 1918. They switched to night bombing when daylight attacks became too risky. They even brought in larger bombers, massive R-type giants that could carry 1,000-kilogram bombs, which were the heaviest bombs dropped in World War I. One even hit Chelsea Hospital. But British defenses improved faster. Night fighters got better, searchlights multiplied, anti-aircraft guns learned to coordinate. The observer network tightened. But the most dangerous things to the Gotha bombers weren't the guns aiming back at them, nor the British pilots. They had a more serious problem that the Germans couldn't fix: landing. Landing was the real boss level. Tail heavy after fuel burn-off, it flipped more crews than British fighters did. 37 killed in crashes versus 24 in combat, proving the Gotha was deadlier to its own pilots than to the enemy. If there were a Darwin Award for aircraft design, this thing would have won a participation medal. So by 1918, the bomber that had terrorized London was bleeding pilots faster than it could train them. When the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles was specific. All German military aircraft had to be destroyed. Every surviving Gotha was scrapped. No museum pieces, no preserved examples. The bomber that renamed the British monarchy and triggered the creation of the Royal Air Force was erased from history. The Gotha G4 wasn't some super weapon. It was slow as hell, freezing cold, and crashed more than it got shot down. But it proved three things that changed a lot on the war front. Air raids could now reach cities, morale became a battlefield, and that air power needed its own command. Well, that's the Gotha story for you, with all its twists and turns. But as you know, aviation history is full of moments like this, where one machine, one raid, one decision changed everything. Now, if you liked his video, hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next video. And hey, I've added one more wild historical aviation story just for you that is now showing on your screen. Click it and I'll see you on the other side.